Welcome back to Men in the City from Washington, D.C. As you can see behind me, I'm in front of the Jefferson Memorial, right across from Capitol Hill and the Washington Monument. So I thought it would be an appropriate backdrop to use for the discussion today. And remember, for those of you who haven't thought about this in a while, Jefferson's famous quote, or one of his most famous quotes, was that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of tyrants and patriots. So we'll come back to that at the end of the video. In today's video, I want to pose a question, as I'm wont to do in these videos. I want to ask, what happens, what do the authorities do, what does the gerontocracy do when talking points don't work anymore? So obviously, I'm of the opinion, and have expressed this really since June on this channel, that the United States and the global financial system that is centered in New York City are in serious trouble, that the world is slowing down economically, and that this fall we're going to experience a severe or an acute financial crisis. And I'm not convinced that the authorities are prepared for this or can extricate themselves from it. So what are the implications of that is a subject that we're going to talk about in today's video. So I want to begin with a Zerohedge article that I'll link to below that highlights some very disturbing economic trends that are beginning to accelerate in my view. So let's begin with number one. Number one is that excess savings appear to be running out. Now, according to a lot of the studies I've seen, aggregate savings in the United States actually peaked in August of 2021. And they peaked after a deluge of government cash in the form of stimulus packages, unemployment bailouts, student loan moratoriums, Federal Reserve quantitative easing, so forth and so on. The list goes on and on and on. But huge amounts of artificial savings flowed into households in the United States. Well, it appears as though that savings, which as far as I can tell is about $2 trillion, is dwindling, or perhaps it has expired. So that's the first warning sign. Second is that consumers are maxing out their credit cards. And thirdly, in a related sense, they're having a hard time paying for their credit card debt. And some of you have probably felt these effects yourself. But I've seen, on average, APRs on credit cards in the United States are swelling to 20% and moving higher. This is a big problem, and it's beginning to show up in delinquencies of credit card payments in the United States. And no doubt this is pervasive around the world, but I'm going to focus on the United States. The fourth issue is student loan debt. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, there was a moratorium on student loan debt. Well, that moratorium is officially over this fall. So we'll have to see what the implications of that are, but there are trillions of dollars of student loan debt that have to be paid. So again, that's another debt bubble that is set to burst sometime this fall. Fifth, and this is an interesting one, is that 401k hardship loans have spiked 36% this year. So the majority of older Americans, particularly baby boomers and Gen Xers, have a lot of their money in 401ks. So if they're withdrawing money, it suggests that they're having a hard time getting by month over month. Not a good sign. The sixth is that banks continue to tighten lending standards. Now, liquidity is essential for the economy to function, but especially in the United States, where over 70% of our GDP emanates from consumer spending. But remember that the government itself is also financed, right? So it has to borrow on a year-over-year basis just to get by, just to clear its books. So our entire economy is essentially financed, which means that if liquidity or capital from the banking system dries up, we're in a lot of trouble very, very quickly. The seventh is that the cost of housing continues to soar. Now this one is somewhat mystifying because while inventories are low relative to the number of households in the U.S. economy, my sense is that housing prices are still overpriced. Nevertheless, that is putting a strain on the market because you need people to move into homes, and ultimately you need some kind of equilibrium in the housing market. That appears not to be the case. It's my view that you're going to see housing prices massively adjust to the downside, but at the moment it's a market that should be watched because of the strain that it's posing, especially with mortgage rates moving as high as they are on households around the United States. The last couple that I'll address come from the ratings agencies. So Moody's has recently downgraded again the U.S. banking system. This is not as big of a deal as you might think, not because the U.S. banking system is above board as much as the ratings agencies themselves don't have the best track record. That being said, it's something to watch. Corporate defaults have also surged in 2023. So what's happening outside of the government sector, what's happening outside of your Fortune 500 companies that appear to be flush with cash, at least on their balance sheet, they have lots of liquidity. Most small businesses don't have that excess. And so they're feeling the pinch once again of higher rates. And remember, and this is the last item that's pointed out in this article from Zerohedge, higher rates tend to have a lag effect. So just because you jacked up rates in February doesn't mean you're going to feel the effects until later that year or later in the next year. All that is to say, it appears as though all of these issues are beginning to bubble to the surface. Now, to the question, what does this mean for authorities? How are they going to react to this? And I address this in my most recent essay in the Men in the City blog, which I'll link to below. But human systems show their strength not in the planning phase, but in the reaction phase, right? This is the concept that Nassim Taleb talks about a great deal. He calls it anti-fragility, but it's essentially how shocks to the system are absorbed. Well, my contention is that the U.S. government, its policymakers, its elected officials, and the appendages of government, the central banks in particular, are not ready for this. Well, why do I think that? I think that because of the character, the personality types of the folks that are in power. And I'm going to use a quote that comes from John Kenneth Galbraith, who wrote a book that I reference all the time in my work and go back to again and again, because I think it does an excellent job of explaining the gerontocracy, the nature of the older generation that's piloting companies, corporations, governments, businesses, et cetera, that have been around for a long, long time. So let me read this quote, and then we'll talk about it. In practice, the individual or individuals at the top of institutions are often there because theirs was mentally the most predictable and, in consequence, bureaucratically the least inimical of the contending talent. He, she, or they are then endowed with authority that encourages acquiescence from subordinates and applause from acolytes and excludes adverse opinion or criticism. Thus, they are admirably protected in what may be a serious commitment to error. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that the people that get to the top are often those that conform the most. They are, according to consensus, the least likely to do anything erratic or take drastic action. They're going to do whatever the group tells them to do. That is exactly the character type that's in power in Washington, D.C., that's in power in Brussels, but also of the folks that are running the central banks. And before this video, I went back and did a little refresher on the backgrounds of two of the most important central bankers in the world. One is Christine Lagarde, who now runs the ECB, the European Central Bank, and before that ran the International Monetary Fund, and Jerome Powell, who is now the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Well, these are two creatures of a very bureaucratic and corporate environment, the likes of which are mentioned by Galbraith. Jerome Powell is an attorney by trade who worked for various law firms, but also worked inside either government bureaucracy or for investment banks his entire life. Lagarde's background is virtually the same. She worked for various law firms, or she worked inside of government bureaucracies and banking institutions her entire life. Well, these personality types mitigate strongly against dynamism, against reactivity that's going to effectively deal with a very fluid, dynamic, and chaotic circumstance, which is precisely where I think we're headed this fall and beyond. So again, what is going to happen when talking points, when probing the marketplace with little droplets of Federal Reserve talking points and meeting minutes don't work anymore, when the market is no longer convinced that they're in control, when riots in the street begin. Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, they're going to break like glass. You're going to see a bevy of resignations. You're going to see a flurry of governmental collapse of sort. And I think it's going to start this fall because of this intensity, this acceleration of all of these socioeconomic problems that appear to be gaining momentum in the US bond market in particular. Meaning that each passing month, because of the volume of debt that the US government has accumulated, it's getting harder and harder and harder for these same agents of the gerontocracy to convey the impression to the marketplace, right? To various participants around the world, both inside American banks and investment companies and corporations and businesses, and yes, households and consumers, and to folks that are in the same categories around the world. It's getting harder and harder and harder for them to convey the impression of competency and reassure the market that they have things well in hand. This fall, I think they're going to be exposed, which means that you're going to see riots in the street, which means that you're going to start to see the procedure of government break down. You're going to see the fall of tyrants. What happens when talking points don't work? Ponder that between now and the next video. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.